Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Elder Justice Initiative's webinar, Recognizing and Responding to Trauma in Older Adults. My name is Keely, and I just have a couple housekeeping reminders to go over with you today. So your microphone and video have been disabled and will remain off. The PowerPoint and recording will be posted on the EJI website in the coming weeks. Closed captioning is available via the Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions today, please submit them to the presenters via our Q&A box. We will get to them towards the end of the presentation. If you need any technical support, please use the chat to message our technical support specialist, Bess Hoskins. And before I hand it off to Shelly Jackson with the EJI, I just want to give a big thank you to our ASL interpreters that will be supporting us today. And now I'll turn it over to Shelly.
Okay, thank you, Kaylee. My name is Shelly Jackson. I'm with the Elder Justice Initiative, and our mission is to support and coordinate the department's enforcement and programmatic efforts to combat elder abuse and forms of fraud. So we do this by promoting justice for older adults, for helping older victims and their families, by enhancing state and local efforts through training and resources, and supporting research to improve elder abuse policy and practice. Next. So I invite you to take a look at our Elder Justice website at elderjustice.gov, where you'll find information and resources about elder abuse. And now what I'd like to do is introduce our presenters. Next. So Justin Ramsdell is an associate professor of psychology at George Mason University, where his teaching and research focuses on forensic psychology and specifically law enforcement interactions with victims of crime and individuals diagnosed with severe mental illnesses. And he'll be discussing the experience, signs, and symptoms of trauma in older adults. And he's joined by Ashley Kimmick, who is a detective with the Cambridge Police Department in the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Unit. Detective Kimmick will be describing how the Cambridge Police Department, as an organization, adopted trauma-informed practices. And with that, Professor Ramsdell and Sergeant, Kimmick, I will leave it to you.
Thank you, Shelly. I appreciate it. We're going to do this in kind of a handoff style. You're going to hear from both of us going back and forth the entire presentation. But before I get into how we're going to do this, thank you first to the Office of Victims of Crime and Elder Justice Initiative for coordinating the webinar, and thank you to everyone on the webinar for all the work that you guys do and have done and continue to do. We're going to be covering a lot of information in a short period of time. If we really wanted to get into this would be a whole day, like obviously, but we're going to condense it as much as we can without losing any of the important pieces. But it means that we're going to be moving pretty quickly. And so we've set this up in kind of a two-tier thorn. Sergeant Kimmick's going to be discussing what the Cambridge Police Department's trauma-informed victim interview guidelines look like and how they go about those practices. And then we're going to be pausing in the middle of those in the explanation of that for me to chime in about why the practices that they're using are a good idea and kind of explain the medicine and the science behind the use of those practices, right? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sergeant Kimmick, who's going to introduce you to their trauma-informed victim interview guidelines.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. First, I'll give you just a quick snippet of what we got into with our initiative of trauma-informed practices for police. It's essentially three things. We wanted to create a newer culture and capacity to focus on the well-being and resiliency of staff, which avoids secondary trauma re-victimization, and obviously mainly the re-victimization or re-traumatization of survivors. We want to increase the knowledge, skills, and confidence of our staff to respond to survivors in a trauma-informed manner, and our interactions should be improved, therefore, with this information with the public in responding to trauma-informed manners, which obviously as police and law enforcement and social workers, we're all involved in dealing with people with trauma. So our training too is about a 3-day training. So what I'm going to focus on and weave in and out of Dr. Ramsdell's science is our interview practice, which has essentially 4 stages: officer preparation, setting the tone and rules, crime scene narrative, and then closure and a case plan.
Now, before we get into that, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of talking about trauma, right? And while newer generations have adopted a lot of clinical language and talking about mental health issues is much more accepted in current generations, and I think that's great. But sometimes, like, the language that mental health professionals use has kind of gone mainstream and got watered down. And I hear a lot of, especially my college students, describing events as traumatic that perhaps somebody else might describe as just unfortunate, but not necessarily traumatic. So I want to make sure we're all on the same page. When it comes to trauma, right, the DSM definition of trauma would be any exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And that can happen in several ways. Obviously, directly experiencing the traumatic event is going to count. And witnessing the traumatic event. Let me come up with one example that might explain all of these. When if you are walking down the street and a construction crane collapses and falls on you, and you almost die and you sustain serious injuries, that's going to be a traumatic event, right? It's like serious injury, right? Or threatened death. If you are walking down the street and the crane collapses and the person in front of you gets hit with the crane and severely injured, that could also be potentially traumatic for very obvious reasons. Learning that the traumatic event occurred to a loved one, right? A spouse, a child, right? And that should make sense to most people if you're in like a loving relationship. And then lastly, right, not in line with this example, is if you experience repeated exposure to details of traumatic events. And when I think about this, I think about EMTs or officers who are seeing serious injury over and over again, or who are seeing survivors of violent incidents, or responding to one or more scenes of a murder or a mass attack. But it's that repeated exposure over and over. So it's not just a single event, right? But it didn't happen directly to you and you didn't witness it, but you're seeing the details and the fallout in the wake of that event over and over again. In the DSM, that counts as trauma. Now, we're here to talk about what this means with an older population, but trauma is trauma, right? The criteria for what makes something traumatic is not based on age, right? It's just based on human beings. And so a lot of the things we're talking about will be true for everybody. And when something is like especially true of someone who is older, then I'll be sure to point that out, right? Now, there will be this is hard trauma, because if I'm going to diagnose trauma as a clinician, I'm going to use PTSD criteria, right? There are 6 categories within the PTSD criteria. They're listed there. Not all the other criteria are, but I'm going to use the PTSD criteria, or I'm going to use, like, if it's a patient of mine, I'm going to use a change in baseline behavior. The patient was acting a certain way, and then something happened, and then they started acting differently. And so I see that event had an effect on the person. Unfortunately, when it comes to law enforcement, like, you are not a clinician. You haven't been trained to be a clinician and aren't expected to be. So the PTSD symptoms, while you could read them, is not going to be available for you. And if you're coming to the scene of an elder abuse scenario, you're not going to have access to what the baseline is, right? You're getting there after the event. And so you're not going to be able to see that change in baseline. And that's going to make identifying trauma like all the more difficult for a law enforcement officer. And we'll expand on that in a little bit.
So for our first step of dealing with someone who's been through a traumatic incident, I will say is that we do have one leg up, is that we know we're going to interview someone that has been through a traumatic incident. So obviously we should keep that in the forefront of our mind. What we want to do is gather all available reports. If something's been reported for elder abuse, if there have been secondary reports, if there's video evidence, talk with other first responders that were there, talk with dispatchers, essentially collect all that you can. Your investigation will continue, but you want to be prepared to have everything before you will sit down with this individual.
And there's good reason for that. Like it's obviously you're going to want to hear the account, and we're going to talk about interview strategies and tips and techniques and things that you can use. But the more information that you can get from other sources, or the better. Like the fewer times that somebody has to recount the trauma means less chance of that person developing PTSD symptoms or you re-traumatizing the people. But remember, PTSD it's a remembering problem. Like, yes, part of the criteria means people might not be able to remember certain aspects of the event. However, in the broad brushstroke, PTSD is your brain remembering things when you don't want to remember that thing. You would rather not think about that thing. And yet your brain is intrusively throwing those thoughts, those images, those feelings at you. And so I would just suggest trying to be as efficient as possible in getting information from people so that there isn't as much of a chance of re-traumatization.
So what we have in our department is we actually have a couple of victim advocates that will be assigned to these more severe traumatic cases. A lot of them primarily are abuse with domestic violence, sexual assaults for all age groups. And what we do is have the investigator work with the advocate to make sure that they can schedule or give times before they even call the victim. They want to make sure that they're on the same page. We want to make this process as seamless as possible for our victims. And we want to make sure we have an advocate present. If you don't have that, obviously you have what you have and you try to work to the best of your abilities. But when we didn't have advocates, we were doing 2 detectives. And then we want to make sure once that victim is all set with their interview and they do come in, we want to approach the interview or every interaction with our victim essentially in a calm, compassionate, and empathetic way. We don't want to show any of our biases. We don't want to show whether you believe the person, whether you don't believe the person. And so what we say is try to be aware of your own, tics or your own anxious behaviors, clear your schedules. If you're sitting there shaking your knee, even if you aren't impatient and you're shaking your knee, you might tend to give off the impression that you're in a rush or that, you're not fully listening or actively listening to that person. So we want you to be aware, and it is a little bit of a change in your tactics for how you do things because we are sitting back in this approach to trauma-informed interviewing.
And I think this is especially true in these situations because like emotional states can be contagious, right? Unless you are a psychopath, which I'm hoping no one who's doing this job is, then like fear and anxiety, especially as emotions, can be contagious in groups. And you know this if you're next to someone who's anxious and they're like vibrating and they're very at some point you're going to be like, all right, dude, you're freaking me out right now. Like you got to calm down, right? And so it's on you. You can only control yourself, but you having a calm, relaxed demeanor is going to, one, ensure you're not sending the wrong message, and 2, help actually calm that other person down and kind of stop the contagion.
So when we set into phase 1, we set the tones and rules of our interview. We do our introductions and explanation of our roles. We explain the purpose of the interview and we gather as much information as possible. Notify that the interview will be recorded. We do that for a couple of reasons, and one is so we can actively listen to our victim, and we're not pausing to take notes and missing important details that would make them have to repeat themselves, which would obviously be re-traumatizing. As a standard practice, we don't allow anybody else in the room besides an advocate, because we have to explain that there's a confidentiality issue with that and potential testimony hiccups. We also emphasize the importance of providing all the information. We have to get all the information no matter what. We don't want our victims to decipher what's important and what's not. There is a good balance between getting all the information and picking out the quality information, but that's pretty much for us to determine. You know, just a quick example, if you're dealing with a sexual assault and the person is going on and on, in the past, we may not have thought that the fact that they intricately described a bedside table lamp while this person was raping them, we wouldn't think that that table lamp had any significance, but now we'll go take a picture of that table lamp, because if someone was in a consensual sexual encounter, odds are they're not going to remember intricate details of a bedside table lamp. That is not consistent with consent. So that's an indicator of trauma. That's where we want all our information, and we will weed out the pertinent nuggets. And it's also very important not to interrupt. So we want to ask the victims not to guess about anything, which we'll go into this back and forth a lot, both of us, about memory recall. And we want to let them know that a traumatic experience will affect the way the brain stores information and that it's normal. So we want to empower our victim. We want to let them know that it's quite normal that some of this information is not coming to you now. It may come to you later. It may not come to you later. There's nothing wrong with you. It's how the brain reacts to trauma. And we have to make sure that they know that, so they don't feel that they're going to essentially fail, for lack of better terms, the interview.
So to get into somewhat why this is important, right? We got to talk about the brain for a little bit. And it's somewhat obviously, I mean, you can get an entire doctoral degree in clinical neuroscience. So because your brain's complicated, you've got roughly 80 billion neurons. Every neuron is as complicated as New York City. And there's 80 billion of them. Your brain is basically 3.5 pounds of protein and fat that floats in fluid in your skull and runs on electricity and is somehow responsible for you seeing me and hearing me and having your own thoughts and being worried about stuff and being able to drive a car and being able to tell when the water is warm. And so like, we're still sorting things out when it comes to the brain. Like it's very complicated, but we do know a couple things, right? Now, I'm going to explain something that you may already know, right? But I want to cover just the broad brushstrokes so that we can get to the memory stuff and some of the more important things here. You're very aware of fight or flight response, which we now add freeze to: fight, flight, and freeze, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But when your brain's fight or flight response happens, there's three structures in your body that kick into gear, right? The first of them is your hypothalamus. What you need to know about your hypothalamus is that it's your brain's grand central station, right? Like almost all thoughts in your brain in some form or another pass through the hypothalamus. And your brain communicates using a series of chemicals: dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA. And that's how your neurons communicate with each other. The rest of your body communicates differently, right? Your endocrine system, it communicates using hormones. So there's this brain-body disconnect in the sense that your brain basically speaks in Latin and your endocrine system speaks Spanish, right? And they can't communicate. The brain can't like tell all the endocrine system components what to do. The hypothalamus, because it's the grand central station, it translates that message for your endocrine system. That's why it's important. That sends it to the pituitary gland, which probably sounds familiar from junior high health class when like boys and girls are going to go through changes at certain ages, and you're blah, 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 and this is going to happen to your body. And it absolutely does that, and it's all very important. But the other thing that your pituitary gland does is it functions as the master gland. It communicates messages to all of the other glands in your body and tells them what to do, or has the ability to tell them what to do. So that message from the brain gets translated with the hypothalamus, sent to the pituitary gland, which can translate it in Spanish out of Latin, and sends it all the way across the body to everything. And the most important part that it sends it to are your adrenal glands, right? And those release adrenaline or norepinephrine. The name has changed over time. But those are two little glands that sit on top of your kidneys. And you'll recognize this as like the, oh my God, I almost got hit by a car, right? Oh my God, that feeling you get if you're terrified of roller coasters when you go over that big drop. If somebody throws something big and heavy at you and you didn't see it, all of a sudden you see it coming out of the corner of your eye. Like this process from hypothalamus to pituitary to adrenal gland happens in 100th of a second, right? Now, when each of those structures, right, they help release chemicals into the body that makes that reaction possible. So when this hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, when that is activated, right, the adrenaline is released. And obviously, you know what adrenaline does, that increases physical performance. Your blood pressure goes up, heart rate, your lungs can handle, your lungs have more capacity. So like if you have to use your arms or your legs to run or fight, that they're ready for that, right? One of the other chemicals that gets released are what's called endogenous opioids. These are opioids not dissimilar from morphine, right, or Percocet, which is why humans can get addicted to them rather easily, because your body already has receptors for painkillers, and your body makes its own opioids, and which is why you see sometimes in emergencies, people will go on for 5 or 10 minutes before realizing that they have like a very serious injury, because their body is flooding the system with its own like endogenous painkillers that are made in the body. Right? And then the last chemical that gets released through this process is something called cortisol. You may know cortisol from babies like interacting with their mothers and human need for connection. But one of the things that cortisol does is it releases stores of glucose, so sugar. Like if I'm going to run or I'm going to fight, I'm going to need energy to do that. Right? And your body's always sitting on a store of glucose and energy for an emergency. And when it happens, it releases it. And so you've got the energy that you need to do one of those two things. And this is great if you get attacked, if you see a bear, right? If you're in a car accident, like all of this will be very, very helpful. But we know as human beings that chemicals in the body don't just do one thing. If you have a television, you've seen drug commercials. And the end of those commercials is a laundry list of horrible things that can happen to you if you take a certain medication. And this is true of any chemical. If I have a headache and I take a Tylenol, it's not that the Tylenol just goes to my head, right? The Tylenol goes everywhere in my body, the acetaminophen, the chemical Tylenol. And I can buy it over the counter because it really doesn't have many negative side effects. But with things that do have negative side effects, those have to be prescribed by a doctor. And the same thing is true of those chemicals that I just went over. The first of which, right, is cortisol. Now, while cortisol is incredibly useful in getting rid of and sending the glucose to arms and legs and for you to run, one of the side effects or one of the other effects of hippocampus of cortisol is that it negatively affects your hippocampus and this one structure in your brain in terms of the way that it functions. Your hippocampus is a structure in your brain that's responsible for consolidating all of the memories, right? think of your hippocampus as like your brain's file clerk. You've gone through your day. You've talked to people, you've seen things, you're attending this webinar, you might see cars on the ride home, and your brain's taking in all sorts of information. There may be the sound of the air conditioning or heating in your building. There's things happening outside, lots of information that you're taking in. And when you lay down to go to sleep tonight, your hippocampus is going to take all that information that happened during the day, and it's going to kind of go through it like, oh, I can get rid of this. We don't need this. We don't need this. This is important, right? Or that person was mean to me. I want to remember that. And it's going to put it all in files, or it's going to toss it in the trash. When the hippocampus is flooded with cortisol during an emergency, it has a hard time functioning, right? In fact, in children who are in like long-term abusive scenarios where they're physically abused, sexually abused, or emotionally abused at home, when those children are put in an MRI machine or some kind of other structural imaging technology, the hippocampus in those children is physically smaller. Like that kid is like working incredibly hard and studying and trying to do what they're supposed to do at school, but they're still getting a D or an F on the quiz because their hippocampus is so overrun with cortisol that it doesn't matter how hard they work, they're not putting things into long-term memory, and it has actually physically shrunk the size of the hippocampus. Now, in an emergency, right, this can have real consequences, right? And I want you to think of your hippocampus functioning this way, right? Now, imagine like we were doing this live and you were in a classroom, right? Like old school classroom, the desk with the little table built in on the side, right? And Sergeant Kimmick and I are going to give this entire presentation for an hour. And I'm going to tell you that at the end of it, you're going to take a quiz, right? And this quiz is going to have consequences for you. But the good news is that you can use your notes. You can write down whatever you want in terms of what we're saying, right? Here's the catch. All I'm going to give you to take notes on are those mini Post-it notes. Like not even like the regular good size ones, but like the little ones that are like a third the size. So you can have as many pads of those notes as you want, but you need to take all of your notes on those little mini Post-it notes, right? And then we finish, you've taken all your notes, your hand's all cramped up, right? And then I come around, I hand everybody the quiz. And then as soon as I hand you the quiz, I take those Post-it notes and I just throw them in the air. I take them off your desk and they're gone all over. And they're falling like leaves all around your desk. And I'm like, now you've got 5 minutes to take the quiz, go. That you're obviously going to have a problem with it. Like one, jerk move. Right, but it's a metaphor. I wouldn't do it. But you were here. You were paying attention. Like you were writing down everything that you needed to write down, right? But now, like, if I'm going to ask you to tell me what happened or during the class, you're going to start picking up the notes off the ground. And you're not going to pick up the first note you wrote first. Right? What you're going to do is you're going to pick them up and you're going to start looking at them and you're going to tell me this. Like, oh, here's this piece of information. And then here's this piece of information. And as you've picked them up, you're going to maybe start putting them in order, right? But then if I'm done talking to you, if I give you a couple minutes and then I come back 10 minutes later, you will have found, or the next day even, right? You will have found more of the notes and you would have put them in. But there's also going to be notes that are just gone. Like information that you wrote down, stuff that was there that you're not going to be able to get back because it got stuck to somebody's shoe, it went underneath the heater, right? You don't know what happened. And that is what cortisol does to your hippocampus in an emergency. Like there will be victims that are well-intentioned and are trying to give you information, and they will have a problem doing so because they're picking up Post-it notes that aren't in order. And if you don't know this and you don't understand that this is occurring, what it sounds like from a victim is that they're making things up, right? Because the story isn't logical. It isn't temporal. It doesn't, and it's because they're picking them up. And there's going to be things missing, and you're like, well, why are you missing that? I think you would have remembered that thing, right? Whereas when people lie, right, the story is always in order, because they practiced it in order, right? But it seems like this victim's making stuff up, but they're not making stuff up. They're not hedging their bets. It's just that their memory is literally not working as well as it should because of the brain chemicals. And that's just something that you need to be aware of when we get to that.
So wrapping up our phase one, we want to acknowledge, given all this information that we now know, we want to acknowledge that recalling the events may be difficult or painful, and it's going to bring about a lot of emotions. It could be anger, could be frustration. Obviously, every person's going to deal with this differently, and we want to attend to our victims' needs and answer any questions about the process. And we want to make sure that they too, much like us, that we've cleared our schedule, that they don't have anything in the back of their mind that they're worried about picking up a child, feeding them parking meter. We want to set the tone to make sure that they're also not distracted, that they're fully there and present for getting into our phase two.
And when you're dealing with older adults, it's the kind of thing you're going to want to double check with this kind of information, right? Because like attending to their needs and explaining the process, like, yeah, absolutely, you're going to have to do that for everyone, but you may have to do it more slowly, more clearly. You may have to do it with metaphors. You may have to do it several times, right? With older adults. And which kind of brings us into dementia. Now, if you're here in this training, you've got a basic understanding or a better than basic understanding of dementia. And I don't want to spend too much time like talking about this. But I want to explain the way I want you to think about dementia, if this makes sense, right? So lots of people associate dementia with problems with memory. And that's true, right? But memory is one of the literal thousands of things your brain's doing on a regular basis. And so when you think about dementia, I want you to think of a vacuum cleaner, right? Now, like, I know, bear with me, like this, I'll tie it together because if like, let me see, I like vacuuming, right? It's one of the few household tasks where like you get done and you're like, this just looks nicer. It looks like objectively better. And you're sitting there vacuuming, right? You've got your brand new vacuum and you are excited about it because you feel like I do about vacuuming, right? And you're just like, man, this thing is awesome. It's picking up all the dirt and you're looking at it in the little bag, right? Incredible. And you don't think about it much and you keep using your awesome new vacuum. And then 2 years later, you're using your vacuum and there's a little speck of white something on the floor, right? And you move the vacuum over it and the vacuum doesn't pick it up. And you're like, right? And so then you tap dance with it, the thing on the floor, and then you bring the vacuum over it again and the vacuum still doesn't pick it up, right? And then if you're like me, I'm not saying that everybody does this, then you like reach down, pick up the white thing in your hands, make sure it's not, and then put it back down on the floor and then try and vacuum it for a third time, right? And all of a sudden you're thinking, well, my vacuum's broke, right? My vacuum's not working. And that might be true, right? But your vacuum wasn't working that well the last time you vacuumed, right? Like it's not working because you never changed the filter. It's not working because you never changed the bag in 2 years, right? It just so happens that that little white piece of thing on the carpet was the thing that cued you in. But it wasn't like it was brand new yesterday or last week when you vacuumed. Like it still had the same problems, but today is the day you noticed, right? And that's how dementia works, right? And actually somewhat similar, like in the sense that your vacuum or your brain's getting clogged with like tau proteins and amyloid plaques, and we don't need to get into all that stuff, but the metaphor extends. But when you go to visit grandma, right, and you bring your 5-year-old granddaughter, who she's known for her whole life, like 5 years, and grandma's like, well, who is this beautiful young girl? And you're like, oh crap. Right? Like that doesn't mean, like, if you're having that moment with grandma, then the dementia train left years ago. Right? Today is the day that that white piece of thing on the carpet didn't get picked up by the vacuum cleaner. Right? It's just that you noticed. And we associate dementia with memory loss because it's the hardest thing for someone with dementia to cover up. Right? But that's not how it works. How it works is all of these problem solving, reasoning, planning, right? Fine motor control, like doing tiny things with your hands, all of the processes that your brain does on a regular basis, those are all suffering as a result. Like the whole vacuum is not functioning as well. So think of it less like a memory problem and more just like there's an overall functioning dial for your brain. And I'm going to slowly turn that down, and your brain isn't going to function as well. Now, there are other kinds of dementia, like Lewy body dementia, frontal temporal lobe dementia, things that we don't have the time to get into today that do affect certain areas of the brain and have specific behaviors associated with them. But in general, I want you to think about it that way, because that's going to help you address that individual's needs in an interview, right? Like it's not just the memory. It could be the planning. It could be their hearing. It could be their balance.
Okay, so with all this information and science that we learned from Dr. Ramsdell, we learned this in Cambridge, or started to learn it with our process back in 2016. For me, I found it an absolute game changer in law enforcement, especially with our serious crime victims. So phase 2 here is essentially, where we get into the meat and potatoes of our interview techniques, knowing and being armed with this information. Our job essentially is to be an active listener to our victim's story, and we are going to be the facilitator of their narrative. We're going to essentially help them put their Post-it notes in order. We want to use open-ended questions. We don't want to interrupt them. And it's important to use silence as a tool. I'm a talker, and I think most of us in our fields are talkers. So this is a big adjustment that we need not fill the awkward silences, because recall can be happening during the silence, actually in an interview with our victim. And we also want to avoid asking why questions whenever possible, because we don't want to give the appearance of victim blaming or re-victimization. If you set someone, it's essentially setting someone up, or can be, for failure if we start to ask why questions. Why didn't you scream? Why didn't you tell a family member? Well, why didn't you tell your son or daughter? We don't want to appear that they are the cause for what happened to them. And so we really have to shift away from that, asking why questions in these interviews.
And there's plenty of academic research that backs that up. There's less of it with older adults who are victims of crime, but with sexual assault victims, the use of the specific use of why questions was associated with higher levels of that person feeling blamed, depressed, anxious, violated by the system, and reluctant to seek help. And it's those last two, I mean, obviously none of them are good, but those last two are especially problematic in the sense that when you're dealing with a victim, when it comes to getting a victim the services they need, getting them therapy, or even just like your rapport with the victim, oftentimes you get one shot at that. And if that first interaction leaves them feeling like blamed or depressed or anxious, then you're closing the door not only on your own investigation, but you're closing the door on, or potentially closing the door on, that victim getting the help that they need further down the line from the system.
So we also want to ask sensory and feeling questions. For us in law enforcement, some of those reasons are because they may not have a time and date of when this occurred, because that may be gone from their mind. But if we ask certain questions, and for things, different things for them to draw on instead of a typical, tell me what you saw. Well, perhaps the person's visually impaired, or perhaps it was dark. Maybe they had their eyes closed as a defense mechanism. So we want to get into, what did you hear? What did you smell? That's a big one. What did, did the perpetrator of this crime smell a certain way? And we often get answers that help, and it's also evidentiary for us, of course, but it can help piece these islands of memory together for the victims. And then we also need the dates and times for our PC for crimes, the who, what, when, where. So that's a little bit different, but these are ways to elicit what a person experienced. And we also ask for sexual assaults or abuse, something about, feeling. What did you feel? What body part of theirs touched the body part of yours? Obviously, most of us know we can't put those words into a victim's mouth, for legal reasons, but we have to ask, what did you feel? Where did their body part touch you, and what body part was that? So feeling is also a very important question that we have to ask.
And there's actually really good scientific research on this. If you're trying to, now this research was done with children, right? But the results have shown to be true with adults and older adults as well. Asking a hands question, right? Just like with what Ashley was talking about, like what were you doing with your hands? Like if someone's having a hard time filling in blanks, what was the offender doing with their hands? When they've researched this, 76% of the people undergoing a forensic interview provided an answer. So 3/4 of the people, when you ask this question, a hands question, a foot question, like that type of thing, they will provide answers. And when they do provide answers, 60% of the information in that answer was new details that they had not mentioned before. So if you're looking for a way to get more information, more detail, like just new information that this person has not stated before, then these types of feeling questions, hands questions are absolutely one way you can go about doing that.
And we also want to avoid, aside from the why questions, we really want to avoid questions that request information in a sequential format. Dr. Ramsdell already mentioned that when you're experiencing trauma, you're not going to necessarily be able to recall what happened in order with that Post-it note example. For me as an investigator, this was one of the biggest reasons I think I'm so passionate about this initiative that we have. Is because I think a lot of us who've been in the game for a while here for law enforcement, when someone tells you something that seems inconsistent, that they may stumble over getting out there, recounting details, when it doesn't seem orderly, I think we tend to default to they must be lying, they can't be telling the truth, and you'll have someone at the same scene tell you something very logically. Well, that's not, we find out now that that's not the case, that most of the time, the person telling the logical ordered story is more likely the perpetrator, say in a victim or a domestic violence incident, say. So we don't want to ask these questions because, again, you're setting the victim up for failure, and they can potentially shut down. If they feel that they're not doing something right, especially elderly people, they're already a little more vulnerable, I would say, than, say, your average age person. And then now they're more vulnerable because they're a victim of a crime. If they think that they're not going to be answering your question, say, correctly in their mind, then they may just shut down, and it's not going to help an investigation, but more importantly, it's not going to help them feel heard and a sense of justice.
And so there are other things. We don't want to tell you what not to do without giving you other options, like the hands questions. And when it comes to trying to elicit details that fill in some of the blank spaces, or some of the spots where there's always going to be blank spaces, but spaces where somebody did not pick up those, could not pick up those Post-it notes, right? Then what we're talking about is like start at the end. These are techniques associated with something called a cognitive interview, and some of you've gotten training in that. This will be familiar to you, but think about if you're driving somewhere new, back when you were driving somewhere new and you weren't looking at your phone for directions. You drive somewhere that you've never been before, like whatever, you're going with a party, with a friend, and then you have a good time and you turn around and you go home. And then on the way home, you're like, oh, geez, that's a really pretty church. I didn't even notice that church there on the way home, or I didn't know there was a restaurant there. I didn't notice on the way there. Like when you do things in reverse order, you just pick up new details sometimes. And so the same thing is true when recounting memories. So you can ask the person, just start at the end and then do everything backward for me. And I guarantee that they'll fill in some blank spaces when they do that, and that it will be generally reliable information, right? Now, you can also do the same thing by starting at one point in the middle, and you may already do that. Start in the middle, just pick one spot and say, start from here, and then bring me up to this other point, right? And ask them to do that. And sometimes that will spur new things as well.
So our one of our parts of phase 2 is to follow up on headline style questions. So that's a little bit of a variation of starting from a different perspective. Like Justin said, we sometimes have to go back to headlines, if you will, because we need to clarify, or we feel that perhaps the person has somewhat glazed over. If an event, say, happened in a car, we might have to say, I'd like to talk about what else happened in the car, or everything that happened in the car. We need to go back to that for a couple reasons. We need to make sure that we're not missing anything, but because people will glaze over what's hard to talk about and what they don't want to face. But we usually will need that. We'll need to talk about the hard stuff to share that could be embarrassing. They're scared to talk about, they're upset to talk about, but we have to go back to that. A lot of times we'll get people, they'll just say, and then we went home and then everything happened. We need to know the everything that happened.
And I will say that like that's where like setting the foundation in the prep and in phase 1 is really important, right? And another way of like pushing through resistance can be switching points of view. Just like asking like, what would this particular section of the incident or whatever you're interested in, what would that look like if I were a security camera over here, if I were a fly on the wall, or if I were someone looking through the window, and trying to introduce a different perspective can one, like depersonalize it in terms of like some of the emotional content, and also may give them a different perspective of looking at it where they share more information.
Right. So we have to ask the hard questions in these interviews, and in many of your occupations, you have to ask hard questions. It's important to explain why you have to ask them. Again, this goes to empowering our victims. You know, they're coming to us as strangers and sharing the most horrid details of something that happened to them. We need to try to give them as much power and control back as we can. So, you know, instead of, you know, the old-fashioned way of just, I'm asking these questions, just the facts, and getting this, you know, going through this linear process, we explain to them, we just tell them, we need to know what body part touched your body part. We need to know in your words what body part was inserted into, you know, your body part. We need to know if they, you know, you said they kicked you. Where did they kick you? What contact was made with their foot to what part of your body? And did they have a shoe on? These obviously have a lot to do with elements of the crime for us and law enforcement, but we have to get these hard questions out. And it's important to just say, you know, we know this is difficult, acknowledge it, and explain that we are unable to do our job properly and correctly if we don't have your words, and we are not allowed to give you words to choose from. We need to hear it directly from you.
And so, but it's obviously important to do this without re-traumatizing the individual. This is a game time decision. And if you've been in one of these situations, then you've seen one, and they're all different and unique. But you should err on the side of caution when it comes to these kinds of things. Now, there's a difference, though, I want to say, between asking a hard question or a difficult question and asking an inappropriate question. And we have to kind of come back. So to the brain. This stuff we already talked about, but I didn't talk about the adrenaline and the opioids, right? Now, remember, everything's got a side effect. The side effect of the adrenaline is you have difficulty with executive functioning, right? And obviously in law enforcement and military, they already know this. Like, you train, you drill, so that when the situation gets intense, you're relying on muscle memory, right? And that's why you drill and that's why you practice. But obviously the average person doesn't drill and practice for a traumatic event, and that adrenaline can have problems with your executive functioning. Now, executive functioning, just really quickly, is what happens in your frontal lobe. Like, so that little gray area, that's where you do your thinking. All the rest of the sections in the brain is like hearing, movement, sensation, vision, keeping your heart beating, digesting food. It decodes the world for you so that you can think. And the thinking gets done in the gray part, right? Planning, predicting the results of future actions, right? Like, if I told you that tomorrow you're hosting a luau at your house for 20 people, right? Here's $600, make it happen. And you like, okay, I've got to get decorations. I've got to get some drinks and some food and some paper plates and stuff. And I got to get, holy cow. And I got to go to where do I get the decorations? Where do I get the food? How much is all this going to cost? Like, that kind of planning is what your frontal lobe is there for, right? It does that for you, right? Now, if the frontal lobe is not working as well because we've flooded your body with adrenaline and we've diverted blood away from that part of the brain, like literally diverted blood away, right? The individual might do things that don't make any sense, right? They absolutely will will do things where you're like, what? Like, why would you do that? And so you need to be non-judgmental, right? Let me go back to this. You need to be non-judgmental in dealing with the victim, especially an older one, because like, if cognitive decline is also part of this, then sometimes there's going to be very strange things. And if you don't think that someone is lying, right, or wonder what's wrong with them, it just because they do something, it doesn't necessarily make sense. There's plenty of very valid brain reasons why they would not do things that make sense, right? And this is also true in terms of like inappropriate questions. This is also true of the freeze aspect of the HPA axis. Like, if the person is saying like, I work out every day, right? And this is an example that Ashley gave me. Like, I'm a strong person. I work out every day. But they're telling you that because what they're really trying to tell you is that, like, I froze. I don't want you to think like I didn't fight back because I didn't want to fight back, but I froze. And there's a very real evolutionary reason why that's part of our reaction to a difficult situation. Very quickly, I have 2 German Shepherds. We were walking them in the woods. We came across 4 or 5 deer, right? And my one who likes to do that looked at me like, can we go chase the deer? Is this allowed right now? And so I told them yes, right? And I broke the leashes, and boom, they went chasing after the deer, happily fulfilling their genetic predisposition. And all the deer took off running in one direction, I thought. And then I looked up and there was one. And that one deer didn't move. It stood perfectly still. All the other deer ran away. My 2 dogs ran after those deer running away. And then the one that stood still just went and wandered off safely. Right? That's why, because like, that's hardwired into all animals' genetic code as a possible behavior in an emergency, because it has actually kept us safe, right? So adrenaline, difficulty with executive functioning. Opioids, you've seen opioid drugs and opioid drug users. You know what that does to someone's like emotional state or their ability to communicate emotions. Your endogenous opioids are the exact same way. Like someone will talk and be talking about like horrific details of things, but their face will look like they're kind of reading the ingredients on the Campbell soup can to you. And you're like, wow, that's not how people look after something like this. That's not how you should look. Well, you would, if your body was flooded with opioids, right? And in this case, it's just something that's happening naturally. They didn't take any opioids on the outside.
Right, so we want to essentially start to wrap up our interviews. And I want to go back and just say quickly, it's important to know when we talked about the hard questions and not re-victimizing. If at any time someone wants to stop, we never pressure someone to go forward ever. If they're not ready to stop, I mean, if they don't want to talk anymore, we stop. And then we ask if they want to talk about anything else, if there's anything else that they have questions about, if they have questions about the process or anything that happened that day or during the interview. And it's again back to empowering and giving some control to the victim. But it's also true, we want to thank them for what they've done, what they've shared, and the fact that they were, you know, brave enough to come in and talk with us and trust us with their information. So we're emphatic about thanking people and encouraging them to stay involved with us in the process if it's going to help them and focus on their life and healing, because unfortunately, as a lot of us know, the system doesn't always work the way we'd like it to work. So the most important thing is to work on their healing, link them with resources. That's what our advocates also do at the end of our interviews. We want to encourage them to link to resources, think about the process. It's in their control if they want to stop it at any time, with the exception, of course, with some crimes. As law enforcement, I do want to say, obviously, if there's some form of a homicide or whatnot, we can't just say, okay, you're done with co-op, you know, we're done here. You don't have to come back. We have to be honest with them.
I would just like to add too, before we go to the next one, that you like to remind everyone that the advocate is there during these interviews as part of your process. So you're not doing this alone. Like there's someone else there who, right, who's watching that process. But just
yes. So we do have the advocate that they'll give them resources at the very beginning of our process before they come in for an interview, and at the end of our interview, our physical interview, they will give them more handouts, pamphlets. They will give them information, and we answer questions and we talk about next steps. And it's very important that we don't set any expectations or unrealistic expectations, I should say. We explain, you know, we finish our documentation, we will send this to our district attorney's office. We will set up a potential meeting, but you know, this doesn't all have to happen right away. We don't want to say, great job, we're going to nail this guy. Well, because the reality is we might not, and that's just, you know, how it goes. But we're finding by interviewing this way over the last several years, a lot of the times when people truly feel heard and don't feel judged about how their story comes out, that they feel really good about the process. So again, we also give them a contact information sheet about trauma information. And a lot of it is what Justin talked about, you know, things they might experience and the best way to communicate.
And so before we go to the questions, I realize there's almost no time left. There's references here for the academic stuff. I'm supposed, you guys need to see the QR code so that you can click and get to the survey. But I also wanted to say that the slide with our email address on it and contact information, that will be shared after the presentation, and it can be put in the chat. But we wanted to have like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Those slides are complete in the presentation, so that if you wanted essentially that trauma-informed interview guide from Cambridge Police, it's there in the slides and will be disseminated afterward.
Okay, Professor Ramsdale and Sergeant Kimmick, I want to thank you so much for the presentation today. We've gotten great comments. We had questions. We're not going to be able to get to them, but I want to thank everybody for joining us today and thanking our presenters. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. And
Thank you.
if you would like to email us the questions, we will happily answer questions over email. We love talking shop. Sorry we talked for so long.
Thanks, everyone.